Hello, I'm Dominic Walker, JMW's Inside Man, and I'm with Stephen Taylor Heath. Stephen is the head of sports law at JMW. Hello, Stephen.
Good morning, Dominic. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So, Stephen, it's been an interesting time in the world of football, and you and I get excited when we see transfers like Jack Grealish and what's potentially happening to Messi at the moment as well. And I just thought, before we talk a little bit about Grealish's contract and any sort of break clauses that may well be in there, I just thought it might be worth debunking a myth or two, first of all, because people who haven't worked on players' contracts kind of think that they're these vast swathes of documents, and they're fairly standard, aren't they?
Yeah, a player's contract between a player and a club has to meet certain criteria, which is fairly standard in terms of what actually goes into the body of the contract. What tends to change are the commercial terms, which are normally set out in a schedule, which if you're talking about a club at the high end of the Premier League, for example, might have bonuses for getting into Champions League and what have you. But the actual basic terms of the contract remain the same. The only thing that might change is if the player is of a high profile and they use an image rights company, the commercial rights, such as the ability to put the player's name on the shirt, etc., might be in a separate image rights contract, but the basic playing contract as to what the player does in terms of playing for the club is standard.
So Jack Grealish has gone from Aston Villa to Manchester City. Mr. Purslow, I think, recorded a very nice video on social media to explain why Jack Grealish had gone and a break clause. So I just wondered, perhaps you could talk a little bit about a break clause and how it's worked in this scenario.
Yeah, I think it's good that Christian Purslow has made it clear how this transfer has come about, which may assay some of the fans. I would assume he's had the approval of Grealish's advisors to do that, because it's disclosing the negotiations. But effectively what he's saying is that there was a release clause in the contract negotiated last year that if you go over a certain threshold, then effectively the club has to negotiate with the club offering that money for the transfer if the player wants to go. It's similar to the situation last year with Messi, where obviously Messi was saying that there was a release clause in his contract. The issue there was that there was a particular date by which time the release had to be triggered. If it wasn't released by that date, then he couldn't use that. He was arguing that because of COVID, the season was elongated, and so that date had moved later in the year, which the club didn't accept. So it's very important that these clauses are drafted very carefully so that if the player wants to rely on them, he can, particularly if the club doesn't want to sell. And that has relevance to Harry Kane, for example, where there's talk of a gentleman's agreement in relation to that, but there's no such thing as a gentleman's agreement from a legal point of view. You can have a verbal contract, but a player's contract has to have everything in writing. So effectively, if there is an agreement with a release clause, it needs to be carefully drafted. You might recall a few years ago with Luis Suarez, where Arsenal purportedly made a bid just over the release threshold of £40 million, £40 million and £1 to trigger a release clause. And Liverpool publicised that and said that it didn't exist. So obviously, you have to be very careful when you're drafting these clauses to make sure that if the circumstances arise whereby the player wants to go and the club wants to bid, that there is no further negotiation that needs to be done with this selling club.
And you mentioned being careful about drafting clauses. I know that you act for players and you act for agents or intermediaries as well. What sort of things are you looking out for in the contract, albeit a standard one?
Well, simplicity is the key, really, and also you want clarity, because, as I say, if you are acting for the player and the player wants to go and another club wants to bid a certain amount, then obviously what that buying club does not want to do is then have to enter into a protracted negotiation where the price keeps going up and up. In other words, is that figure a threshold that a club has to bid, or is it a starting point for the negotiation? So if you're acting for the player and the club, then the key is to just make sure that whatever clause is inserted has sufficient clarity so that there isn't wiggle room from one of the parties who perhaps doesn't actually want to sell the player.
Excellent. Stephen, thank you very much for your time and your expertise, as always. And if you'd like to speak to Stephen, who is head of sports law, you can contact him insideman@jmw.co.uk or call 0161 82 81 999. I'm Dominic Walker, JMW's Inside Man.